I was a janitor fired for theft until I exposed the manager's drug ring. But that morning, as I stared at the termination papers clutched in my trembling hands, I had no idea that Marcus Chen's desperate attempt to frame me would become the very thread that would unravel his entire operation. The security footage allegedly showed me slipping something into my jacket pocket near the pharmaceutical storage room. Marcus had called me into his sterile office at 7 a.m. before the hospital's day shift arrived, his perfectly pressed suit and cold smile making my worn uniform feel like a costume. He slid the papers across his mahogany desk with the casual indifference of a man discarding trash. The accusation was theft of controlled substances, oxycodone, fentanyl patches, the kind of medication that disappeared regularly from hospitals, the kind that made headlines when it ended up on the streets. My 23 years of spotless service meant nothing to him. The employee handbook cited zero-tolerance policies. The union representative nodded sympathetically, but explained that video evidence made appeals nearly impossible. I walked through those familiar corridors one last time, my master keys surrendering their weight to my palm as I dropped them into the security guard's outstretched hand. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal tune above me, casting the same harsh shadows I'd navigated for over 2 decades. Every room held memories. Late nights mopping surgical suites, early mornings restocking supply closets, quiet conversations with nurses who treated me like family rather than furniture. But something nagged at me as I replayed that morning in my head during the long drive home. Marcus had been too eager, too prepared. The termination papers were already typed, dated, signed by HR. The security guard had been waiting. Everything moved with the efficiency of a pre-planned operation, not the chaotic scramble of catching someone in the act. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table studying the termination documentation. The security footage timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remembered that shift clearly. I'd been cleaning the pediatric wing until midnight, nowhere near the pharmaceutical storage. My time card would prove it, but they'd confiscated my badge and access card so quickly I hadn't thought to check the records. I called my daughter Sarah, a paralegal downtown, and asked her to help me understand my options. She listened to my story with the careful attention she'd inherited from her mother, asking precise questions about timelines and procedures. Her legal mind immediately identified the discrepancies I'd felt but couldn't articulate. The next morning, I drove to the hospital parking garage and positioned myself where I could observe the employee entrance. For 3 hours, I watched the rhythm of shift changes, noting patterns, memorizing faces. Marcus arrived at 8:15 a.m. in his silver BMW, already talking animatedly on his phone. He seemed agitated, checking over his shoulder as he hurried inside. That's when I noticed something interesting. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the night shift supervisor who'd vouched for my character, emerged from the building looking exhausted and troubled. She sat in her car for several minutes, staring at her phone, before driving away. Her shift had ended at 7, but she'd stayed an extra hour for something or someone. I followed her to a coffee shop 6 blocks away, maintaining careful distance. She chose a corner table, checked her phone repeatedly, and kept glancing toward the entrance. At 9:30, a man in scrubs joined her, someone I recognized from the hospital but couldn't place immediately. Their conversation looked intense, urgent. She slid an envelope across the table. He opened it, counted something inside, then shook his head firmly. She leaned forward, clearly pleading. He stood up and left without touching his coffee. The pieces began forming a pattern in my mind. I'd worked nights long enough to know which staff members had access to the pharmaceutical storage, which ones worked late shifts with minimal supervision, and which ones had recently started driving newer cars or wearing more expensive clothes than their salaries should allow. Dr. Walsh had always been friendly to me, almost protective. Now I wondered if her kindness had been motivated by something more than professional courtesy. Over the following week, I established a routine of observation. I mapped the hospital's external architecture, identifying which windows corresponded to which departments, which exits were monitored by security cameras, and which parking areas offered the best vantage points. My years of working inside the building had given me an intimate knowledge of its layout, but I'd never studied it from a surveillance perspective. Marcus maintained predictable patterns, arriving early, leaving late, spending considerable time in areas that didn't require his immediate oversight. I began documenting his movements, photographing his interactions, noting who he met with and when. My old smartphone wasn't sophisticated, but it captured enough detail to establish patterns. The breakthrough came when I remembered Jerry Hoffman, a hospital electrician who'd been laid off 3 months earlier due to budget cuts. Jerry had always been bitter about management decisions, and he'd left on bad terms with several supervisors, including Marcus. More importantly, Jerry still had friends among the maintenance staff who might be willing to share information. I found Jerry at Murphy's Tavern on Thursday evening, nursing a beer and complaining loudly about his unemployment situation. He recognized me immediately, expressing sympathy about my termination and anger about the injustice. When I bought him another beer and steered the conversation toward hospital gossip, he proved eager to share what he'd heard through his remaining contacts. According to Jerry, several staff members had been terminated over the past year for various policy violations, always with minimal investigation, always with Marcus personally handling the cases. The pattern suggested systematic elimination rather than coincidental misconduct. Jerry also mentioned that his former colleagues had noticed increased security around the pharmaceutical storage areas, but strangely, the incidence of missing medications had continued despite the enhanced monitoring. That night, I drove past Marcus's house in the upscale Riverside district, a neighborhood far beyond what a hospital administrator's salary should afford. The house was modern, expensive, with a circular driveway holding 2 luxury vehicles. His property taxes alone would consume most of his legitimate income. The landscape lighting illuminated a lifestyle that required additional revenue sources. I began researching Marcus's background through public records and social media. His LinkedIn profile showed a career progression that seemed accelerated. Too many promotions, too many increased responsibilities, too quickly. His Facebook photos displayed vacation destinations and recreational activities that suggested disposable income well above his pay grade. But more interesting were the people tagged in his photos, several hospital employees, including Dr. Walsh, at locations that seemed inappropriate for casual professional relationships. The following Monday, I positioned myself near the hospital's main entrance during the morning shift change. I needed to observe the natural flow of employee interactions, to identify who worked closely with Marcus and who might be part of whatever operation I suspected. I'd brought my old telephoto lens, purchased years ago for photographing Sarah's high school soccer games, now repurposed for surveillance. Dr. Walsh emerged from the building at 7:15, 15 minutes after her shift officially ended. She walked quickly to her car, but stopped halfway there when Marcus appeared from a side exit. Their brief interaction looked tense. She handed him something small. He examined it closely, then shook his head with obvious frustration. She gestured emphatically, but he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot. I documented the interaction, noting the time, location, and apparent emotional content of their exchange. Whatever Dr. Walsh had given Marcus, he wasn't satisfied with it. The transaction had the characteristics of a business dispute rather than a casual professional conversation. That afternoon, I visited the public library and used their computers to research recent drug enforcement activities in the area. The DEA had increased its focus on prescription drug diversion, particularly from healthcare facilities. Several nearby hospitals had been investigated for suspicious patterns of controlled substance usage. The investigations typically began with anonymous tips about unusual prescribing patterns or unexplained inventory discrepancies. I also researched the specific medications mentioned in my termination paperwork. Oxycodone and fentanyl patches were high-value street drugs, but they were also commonly prescribed for legitimate medical purposes. A sophisticated diversion operation would need inside access to both the pharmaceutical storage and the patient record system to manipulate inventories and cover missing medications. By Wednesday, I'd established a more systematic surveillance routine. I arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m. and remained until 10 a.m., documenting morning shift activities. I returned at 6 p.m. and stayed until 10 p.m., observing evening shift patterns. The exercise was revealing patterns I'd never noticed during my years as an employee: who stayed late without apparent work-related justification, who accessed areas outside their normal responsibilities, who interacted with visitors who didn't fit the typical patient or family member profile. Marcus's behavior showed increasing signs of stress. He'd begun smoking cigarettes in the parking garage, something I'd never seen him do before. His phone conversations appeared more frequent and more agitated. He'd started arriving earlier and leaving later, but his time inside the building seemed increasingly focused on non-administrative activities. On Thursday evening, I followed Marcus from the hospital to a restaurant in the warehouse district, an area I'd never seen him visit before. He met with a man I didn't recognize, someone who looked like he worked with his hands rather than in an office. Their dinner lasted 2 hours, and their conversation appeared serious, businesslike. Marcus slid an envelope across the table, similar to what I'd observed with Dr. Walsh. But this time, the recipient seemed satisfied with the contents. I photographed both men as they left the restaurant, capturing clear images of their faces and the license plate of the stranger's vehicle. A simple online search revealed the car was registered to Vincent Kozlov, who had been arrested twice for drug-related offenses, but never convicted. The connection between a hospital administrator and someone with Kozlov's background suggested activities that extended far beyond the hospital's walls. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the DEA's tip line and reported suspicious activities at the hospital, specifically mentioning Marcus Chen and the pattern of employee terminations for alleged drug theft. I provided the investigators with my observations about Marcus's lifestyle, his meetings with Dr. Walsh and Vincent Kozlov, and the timing patterns I documented. But I didn't stop there. I also contacted the state medical board and reported concerns about prescription drug diversion at the hospital. I filed a complaint with the hospital's corporate headquarters about potential management misconduct. I submitted a tip to the local newspaper's investigative reporting team about possible corruption in hospital administration. Then I waited. The investigation would take time, but I'd planted seeds that would grow into something Marcus couldn't control or contain. My years of methodical, detail-oriented work as a janitor had prepared me perfectly for this kind of systematic approach to gathering and presenting evidence. 2 weeks later, the first signs appeared. Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic. Longer phone calls, more frequent meetings with people who didn't belong in the hospital environment, and a general air of paranoia that was noticeable even from a distance. Dr. Walsh had stopped making eye contact with colleagues and appeared to be working extra shifts, possibly to maintain access to controlled substances. I received a call from DEA agent Rebecca Torres, who wanted to interview me about my observations and experiences at the hospital. She met me at a coffee shop near my home, dressed casually but carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Her questions were precise, focused, and suggested that my tip had initiated a larger investigation. Agent Torres explained that the DEA had been monitoring unusual patterns of prescription drug distribution in the region, but they'd been unable to identify the source. My information about Marcus's activities and connections provided the specific intelligence they needed to focus their investigation on the hospital. She asked if I would be willing to provide additional information and potentially testify if charges were filed. I agreed immediately. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had cost me my livelihood while enriching people who'd violated the trust placed in them by patients and colleagues. The scope of the operation was becoming clear, and my termination had been just one small part of a much larger scheme. Over the following month, I continued my surveillance activities, but now I was coordinating with federal investigators. Agent Torres provided me with specialized equipment to document meetings and transactions with higher quality than my old smartphone could manage. I learned to identify undercover agents who were now working inside the hospital, posing as temporary staff members and contract workers. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been running a sophisticated operation for at least 18 months. He'd identified hospital employees with gambling debts, family financial problems, or other vulnerabilities, then recruited them to assist with medication diversion. Dr. Walsh had been stealing controlled substances during her night shifts, when security supervision was minimal. Several other employees were altering patient records to cover missing medications. The operation's external distribution network involved Vincent Kozlov and at least 6 other individuals who were converting the stolen medications into street drugs. The profits were substantial, enough to support Marcus's expensive lifestyle and provide payments to his collaborators inside the hospital. But the operation had grown too large to remain hidden, and my termination for alleged theft had been Marcus's attempt to eliminate someone who might have observed too much. The irony was exquisite. Marcus had fired me to protect his drug operation, but my termination had motivated me to investigate activities I'd previously ignored or dismissed. His attempt to silence a potential witness had created an actual adversary with intimate knowledge of the hospital's operations and enough determination to expose his crimes. On a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 3 months after my termination, I watched from the parking garage as federal agents arrested Marcus at his office. They'd coordinated with hospital security to ensure minimal disruption to patient care, but the operation was thorough and systematic. Marcus's computer, phone, and personal belongings were seized as evidence. His face showed complete shock as agents placed him in handcuffs and escorted him through the lobby. Dr. Walsh was arrested at her home that same morning, along with 4 other hospital employees who'd been identified as participants in the operation. Vincent Kozlov and his associates were taken into custody simultaneously at various locations throughout the city. The coordinated arrests ensured that no one could destroy evidence or warn other participants. The local newspaper's front page the next morning featured a detailed article about the investigation, including my photograph and a statement about how my wrongful termination had led to exposing the corruption. The hospital's corporate headquarters issued an apology for my treatment and offered immediate reinstatement with full back pay. The union representative who'd originally told me appeals were impossible now wanted to schedule meetings to discuss additional compensation for my emotional distress. But I wasn't interested in returning to my old position. 3 months of intensive investigation had revealed capabilities and interests I'd never recognized in myself. Agent Torres mentioned that the DEA frequently hired civilian consultants for cases involving institutional corruption, and she thought my skills would be valuable for similar investigations at other healthcare facilities. The legal proceedings took nearly a year to complete. Marcus Chen pleaded guilty to conspiracy to distribute controlled substances and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Dr. Walsh received 6 years after cooperating with prosecutors and providing detailed information about the operation's methods and scope. Vincent Kozlov and his associates received various sentences ranging from 3 to 12 years. The hospital implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents, including enhanced security for pharmaceutical storage, mandatory background checks for employees with access to controlled substances, and regular audits of medication inventories. Marcus's position was eliminated entirely, with his responsibilities distributed among multiple managers who would provide checks and balances for each other's activities. On the anniversary of my termination, I stood in the hospital parking garage where I'd begun my surveillance activities. The facility looked the same from the outside, but everything had changed because of what I discovered and reported. My determination to clear my name had evolved into something much larger, a systematic dismantling of corruption that had affected countless patients, families, and honest employees. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, who was now handling my legal affairs related to the wrongful termination settlement. The hospital's insurance company had offered a substantial financial agreement in exchange for my commitment not to pursue additional civil litigation. The amount would allow me to pursue new career opportunities without financial pressure. As I drove away from the hospital for what I expected would be the last time, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past year. I'd entered that building as a janitor who'd been framed for theft. I was leaving as someone who'd exposed a criminal operation and helped federal agents dismantle a drug distribution network. The man who tried to destroy my life was now serving time in federal prison, while I was beginning a new chapter with opportunities I'd never previously imagined. Marcus Chen had made a critical miscalculation when he'd chosen me as his scapegoat. He'd assumed that a janitor would be powerless against a hospital administrator, that my lack of formal education or professional connections would prevent me from challenging his narrative. He'd underestimated the methodical attention to detail that 23 years of institutional maintenance work had developed in me. More importantly, he'd failed to recognize that stealing my livelihood would transform me from a passive observer into an active investigator. His attempt to silence me had created his most dangerous enemy, someone with intimate knowledge of his environment, unlimited time to gather evidence, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The final irony was that Marcus had been partially correct in his original assessment. I had been observing activities that could have threatened his operation, but I'd been too focused on my work responsibilities to recognize the significance of what I was seeing. His termination of my employment had provided the motivation and perspective I needed to understand what had been happening around me for months. 6 months later, I was working as a consultant for a private investigation firm that specialized in institutional fraud cases. My first assignment involved suspected embezzlement at a manufacturing company, but the methodical approach I developed during the hospital investigation proved equally effective in different environments. The skills I'd learned through necessity had become professional capabilities. Agent Torres had been right about my potential value to law enforcement agencies. The combination of institutional knowledge, attention to detail, and patient observation that had enabled me to expose Marcus's operation were exactly the qualities needed for investigating complex white-collar crimes. My background as a maintenance worker provided access to areas and perspectives that traditional investigators often overlooked. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my new career was the knowledge that Marcus Chen was serving his sentence in federal prison while I was building a legitimate professional life from the ashes of his betrayal. Every successful investigation I completed, every case I helped solve, every criminal I helped expose was a testament to the power of persistence and systematic thinking over institutional corruption and abuse of authority. The man who tried to frame me for theft was now a convicted felon whose actions had been exposed in federal court and documented in permanent legal records. The operation he'd spent months building had been completely dismantled. His co-conspirators were serving their own prison sentences, and his victims had received justice through the legal system. I never saw Marcus again after his arrest, but I sometimes wondered if he understood the irony of his situation. His attempt to eliminate a potential threat had created an actual adversary who'd been more dangerous than he could have imagined. His strategic miscalculation had cost him everything: his freedom, his career, his reputation, and his future. As I drove through the city on my way to a new investigation, I passed the hospital where everything had started. The building looked exactly the same, but I knew that the corruption I'd exposed had been eliminated, the reforms I'd prompted had been implemented, and the patients who relied on that institution were now better protected because of what I discovered and reported. That knowledge was worth more than any monetary settlement or professional opportunity. I'd transformed a personal injustice into a systematic victory over institutional corruption. The janitor who'd been fired for theft had become the investigator who'd exposed the thieves.